Read One Communications presents the Scholars Chair. We have invited tonight religious leaders from the Unitarian Universalist, Islamic, Christian, and Humanist philosophical tradition to discuss the writings of Dr. Ibram Kendi on how to become an anti-racist.
My name is Scrivo. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. Unitarian Universalism is a covenantal faith. We're guided by our 7 principles rather than a common creed. Our principles focus on how we are with each other and in the world. They cover things like respecting every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and democratic principle, and respecting the interdependent web of life, which we're all a part. Those are all good, and yet they don't specifically address racism. As a liberal, predominantly white faith tradition, we have a history of fighting racism and also of falling short. During the last several years, we've been examining our own history of racism along with our proud moments of joining abolitionists, marching during the civil rights movement, and working to ensure that Black Lives Matter. Our denomination has recently been discussing adding an 8th principle that calls for, quote, working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. This has led to some difficult discussions within our congregations, some saying our current principles already cover this, and others citing the need to explicitly commit to being anti-racist. During these debates, I've noticed that we often have differing definitions of being anti-racist or what a racist is. I really appreciate Dr. Kendi's definition of a racist as believing certain racial groups are better than others and supporting policies that lead to inequity and injustice. Some of the debate in my denomination has been about our denial or discomfort over our part in racism. We like to think of ourselves as good people. Definitions of racism that focus on the actions of a few bad and immoral people make it harder to accept that we are socialized in a culture of white supremacy and that we have supported and do support policies that can lead to inequality and injustice. Seeing racism as individual acts also paints racism as a problem of hatred and ignorance. This puts the focus on changing racist minds through education and moral appeals. As Dr. Kendi says, quote, the source of racist ideas was not ignorance or hate, but self-interest. He goes on to say, treating ignorance and hate and expecting racism to shrink suddenly seems like treating a cancer patient's symptoms and expecting the tumor to shrink. But as Dr. Kendi notes, the problem of racism has been at the core a problem of power, not a problem of immorality or ignorance. So trying to change racist minds before changing racist policies hasn't really worked. Dr. Kendi notes that people's attitudes changed after policies had changed. He points to the white support of desegregated schools and neighborhoods came after policies changed in the 1950s and 1960s. Support for Obamacare came after its passage. Fighting for mental and moral changes after changing policies, Dr. Kendi says, quote, means fighting alongside growing benefits and dissipation of fears, making it possible for anti-racist power to succeed. For me, this has also opened up space to admit the anti-racist ideas within my own life. I'm sorry, the racist ideas within my own life, to confront the racist policies and ideas that I support, and to find places that I can work with others against anti-racist policies.
And my experience from the umbrella of the different faiths, there is an expression of love, there is an expression of caring for our brother, there is an expression of love God, love our fellow man and our family. So in that context, it's kind of hard to see how we as human beings in 400 years hasn't mastered that lesson. And when I think of the lessons that the author here is talking about, it seems like even today, we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. So much of when I look to a scripture that could support what I wanted to say today, I went to Micah, the book of Micah. It says, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Now that seems pretty simple. Seems like a pretty simple thing to do. But in reality, for us human beings, it seems like a difficult thing for us to do. Although we are I believe the scientific word is Homo sapiens, that's supposed to put us at the point of the pyramid when it comes to our ability to learn, to investigate, to analyze, to make decisions based on what our desires are and how we matriculate in God's universe. We kind of fall back to the level of the other animals in the kingdom to move into our reptilian expression. So when I think about all of the things that we talk about here, is if we move to a point of living with a consciousness of a lack of equity in terms of how we live in the world. That equity, that inequity, that concept or belief in equity falls outside of what we in each of our faith truly believes. So he talks about and explores many different aspects of why that is true. One that really spoke to me was the distinction of distinction of being racist and racism, and how each of those flows into different aspects of our being. Racism has more to do with the policies, the structural system in which we operate. So when I think of that, I begin to think about the structural system for me in terms of laws, policies, guidelines, beginning with the Emancipation Act, going on down to the 13th Amendment, coming on down to the Civil Rights of 1964. And even in terms of our own work environments, structures are in place. Structures are in place in many instances, yet we as human beings and that which we learn on Sunday morning kind of falls flat in terms of our daily lives and our activities. That sense of inequity moves into our being, as opposed to our practicing what we preach, what we dance about, and what we sing about. One of the things that is talked about in our book is the racist, in terms of how that energy is expressed. That's more of the individual when it comes to our thoughts, our words, and our actions as an expression. And for me, the difference in where we are in terms of our universal expression, we may have laws, but we can have the laws, but it's the consciousness of the individual that activates that really make it work. The other two things I want is the aspect of power that he talks about. And that was important for me to understand, because that we have power, but it's our interpretation and our understanding and our application of that power in our environment that really moves us forward. Mm-hmm. Secondly, what I want to say is about the author himself, and that is he's a recovering cancer patient, and what happened during the time that he was writing this book. His thought was, when they were asking him, okay, do you stop writing this book? And his question was, well, I was going to put some things in this book, but before I got the cancer, I was thinking, well, they may not like me, so I'm going to not put this in the book. But then after he said, well, I may be dead when the book is published, so it'd be all right to do that. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that how so often we choose not to act in a way that expresses our own being to the fullness, because we fear what someone else will do, what someone else will say.
What we suggest as, and what do I mean by humanists? You have a number of humanist organizations. One of them is an African American humanist organization, of which I am one of the members. And we had a meeting here, a universal meeting of us about 5 years ago. Now, the idea is that for most of us, we reject the notion of a Christ who is a God. That's just beyond the pale for most of us. Most of us accept the sense of a God, but not necessarily the laws, the dogmas that religion says is the mind of God. Mm-hmm. But we do agree that if there is a will that God has on earth, it must be done through humankind. Mm-hmm. It must be done through humankind. So we say humans actually undergird the whole civilization as to what they feel, think, and treat each other. Humanism, then we should concentrate on human values. Good and not good should be judged based on how it affects human beings, and not because of some ancient motto or ancient ritual or dogma that was done years ago. So what we have as one of our guideposts is we declare that reason and science should lead to our understanding of the universe and of nature. Then generally the Abrahamic religions will not agree to is we attempt to transcend parochial loyalties based on religion, based on race, based on gender. All right? The rules that you find in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, the goodness that is to be done, they're talking about the in group. Mm-hmm. They're not talking about the out group. All right? So we as humanists say, hey, let's deal with out groups as well in bringing people together. So in fact, what you are doing now, Khalil, is not based in Islam talk teaching. It is something you're doing over and above that. You are in the range of humanism and bringing us together to talk about these things. I'll stop here.
Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be with you, all of you. And I will start from where Dr. Bell stopped. So this would be like the reverse of the order of the lecture I was preparing. But in Islam, there is no in-group. And part of the problem about racism, which is somehow connected to our religion, is that the real information about our religion does not come through. So we have to talk about it. The reason we don't have an in-group is because very clearly God says in the Quran that Muslims, good Jews, good Christians, good people, God will judge them to go to heaven. Where is the in-group? The in-group is humanity. And that's the way the Quran talks about us. The most important thing in the Quran, which will get us to the discussion of racism, is that you need to believe in the unity of God. There is only one God, and He is supreme. Everybody else, human under Him, is equal. Anyone who tries to think that they are better than the other are violating a very important principle in Islam, the principle of adala, or justice. So I'm going to tell you two stories that you can think of as parables, but they are also defined elsewhere in the Quran explicitly. And the story goes like this. At the creation of Adam, who was created from clay, God summoned the angels and Satan, Iblis, who was then not cursed, and ordered them to bow to Adam, in whom He has put a spark of divine spirit. And the angels bowed to Adam, but Iblis refused to do so, in violation to the supreme command of the supreme will in the universe. What could possibly make Iblis take such a huge risk so as to disobey God? And the Quran asks, it says that God asked Iblis, so that we know the answer, what prevented you from obeying me? And Iblis said, basically, it's obvious. I'm better than he is. He's made from clay, I'm made of fire. That story talks about hierarchical thinking, oppressive thinking, that goes not only to race, but to gender, to beliefs, to all sorts of areas. Anytime you catch yourself saying, I'm better than he is, you're using satanic logic. That's what the Quran tells us. And the Quran says, we created you of male and female and made you into nations and tribes so that you get to know each other. That is, so that you celebrate each other's differences, variety, not so that you could say, I am better than you in the satanic mode. But that's only half the story. Why is saying I'm better than you so serious? There comes the second story about Adam and Eve in the garden. That's when Satan told Adam, if you eat from that forbidden tree, it's not an apple tree, forbidden tree, you will have an eternal life and a kingdom that does not end. In other words, if we violate God's order to us, that we are all equal, only God is supreme, if we violate that, Satan is telling us, but there are rewards. You will get rewards for that. What are the rewards? To say I'm better than you is not just a statement, it has consequences. And one big consequence, if I can make it as big as you could see it, is what colonialism did to countries where the white man said, I'm better than you are. And therefore, you don't need your resources as much as I need them. And in this country, you don't need as much wealth as much as I need it. And you can go on and on and on because I am better than you are. That's the beginning of the sin. That's the primary sin, because you are rejecting the supremacy of God and his order. So I think there's a third piece I will throw in and then I'll be quiet. When Satan was cursed, he asked God to give him reprieve until the day of judgment. He said, I will show you this Adam, you liked him better than me, you preferred him to me. I'll show you what I can do with him. And God gave Satan the reprieve. And when I talk about this, I tell my Muslim students, what the story says is that the test of Adam did not end with Adam coming out of Eden. That everybody on earth, every one of us, will have their own test. The test as to whether you think you are better than others, and the test whether you're greedy, and because you think you're better than others, you're gonna take away all their privileges and appropriate them to you. And so, Dr. McGuffey, I am not as hopeful as you are that very quickly we can end up in a situation where we raise everybody's consciousness and there is no evil. I think it's a constant human struggle between what God told us and what Satan is trying to tell us. But I do think that in the end, humanity will win against the evil temptation. How do I know that? Because when God was creating Adam, the angels objected. They said, how could you create somebody who is going to spill blood on this earth? And God said, I know what you do not know. And I think what God knows is that in the end, we will be able to save humanity and ourselves.
Evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here. As Khalil said, I am Reverend Norman Allen. I have the great honor of serving Davies Unitarian Universalist congregation in Camp Springs. I know we're well represented this evening in the audience, so hello to everybody. For me, the way Dr. Kendi approaches this work of anti-racism feels very closely aligned with our work as faith leaders and in line with the work of all of our congregations. Anti-racism, as Dr. Kendi says, is active. It's something we do, something we can fail at, something we can learn to do better. In the same way, I think all of us are moving towards something. We don't sit in our faith. Our faith is not static. We are challenged by it, whatever that faith is. And that challenge calls us forward. It calls us to become our better selves. So I really love that active nature of what Dr. Kendi is preaching. I also love that he insists we remove the phrase, I'm not a racist, from our language. He just said, stop saying, I'm not a racist, because it's not about who you are or who you're not. It's about what you do. And that, I think, also is in alignment with all of our faith traditions. Our faith is reflected in our actions. It's like that wonderful quote, it's attributed to St. Francis, who supposedly said, go out and preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. I mean, you shouldn't be talking, you should be showing people who you are and what your faith is. So with that in mind, I want to lift up some of the active, faithful, anti-racist work that we are specifically pursuing as Unitarian Universalists these days. And it by chance follows very nicely on what Reverend Karen Scrivo shared earlier. So just one very small, but I think very powerful example. And I know this is happening in other places as well, not just in Unitarian Universalist settings. But for a few years now, if you attend a gathering at our headquarters in Boston or at many of our congregations or at some of our seminaries, the facilitator of that discussion will open by saying something like, we'll now enter into an open conversation. I invite those whose identities are traditionally privileged to sit back a moment until those whose identities are traditionally marginalized have had a chance to speak. It literally brings people from the margins into the center. It reverses basic practices of the last 100 years. It's active anti-racism. Another example of faith and anti-racism coming together is even closer to home. This past June, the Davies congregation took a huge step forward in their history. As Karen mentioned, our Unitarian Universalist faith is officially built upon 7 principles, starting with the inherent worth and dignity of every person. But about 25 congregations across the country, including Davies as of June, have now adopted the 8th principle that Karen spoke about. And that 8th principle calls us to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So that 8th principle is a clear call, a clarion call to faithful anti-racist action. It's a call to accountably dismantle racism. So to enlarge upon that example, or to make it more specific, 2 weeks from now, about 2 weeks from now, all of the committee chairs at Davies are going to come together and meet with the 8th principle task force. And they're going to be introduced to something called a social justice rubric. It's a tool that helps people honestly assess where they are, where their policies and practices might be upholding a culture of white supremacy rather than dismantling it. Then those chairs will go back to their individual committees and they'll start working through that. They'll start looking at really where they are, what their practices and policies are, how they bring people into those committees, how the work is adjusted, and they will start to change and adapt in order to come into alignment with the 8th principle, in order to do the work of dismantling racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So I don't want to pretend that that's not going to be anything but extremely difficult work. It's going to be hard work. But I think it's work that we are ready for at Davies. I think it's work that, as Karen was saying, the Unitarian Universalist movement as a whole is ready for this work and is diving into it already. And I think, certainly for myself, I think for the Davies congregation, reading Dr. Kendi's book and coming together and discussing it, letting his work challenge us and move us forward as people of faith, that will be critical to the work we do. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, everybody.
Super, super. Thank you very much, Norman. That is. I'm glad to know that your congregation is actively engaged in trying to solve the problem. Tell me, what does your theologies, I'm speaking to everyone now, actually, how do you define a racist? What is a racist? Or do your theologies at all inform you what a racist is? I guess we'll just go the way we came. Norman, go right ahead. Would you like to answer the question, or?
Yeah, I don't know that our theology describes or defines a racist, and I'll be happy for Karen to dive in here as well with her thoughts. I think I would, personally, I'm going to fall back on what Dr. Kendi, for lack of a better word, preaches, that it's about action. So I think my understanding from his writing in particular, but also from his recent discussion with the PG County Libraries, is that you could do something racist at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you could do something anti-racist at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So the idea of defining a person as identifying or taking the identity of racist or not racist is a misleading one. Yes. The only thing I would say more specifically to our theology is, as I mentioned, our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person.